Hey guys, this is your High Fist again. I don't really have too many notes for this video as usual, but one thing I thought it would be interesting for us to go through is the role of mythology in Malazan, because I think this series is one of the best examples of godhood and people aspiring towards godhood, and the way that mythology plays a real sort of tangible role in the evolution of society, in the evolution of culture. So, as far as the Malazan series goes, so let me try to, I'm just trying to think, let me break it down into a couple of important factors that I think we need to keep in mind. The first is that the series does, in my opinion, an excellent job in portraying the pettiness and greed and envy of the gods themselves. And this, again, as someone who grew up or is still sort of growing up, I guess, in a sense, in a polytheistic culture, in a polytheistic part of the world, I've always felt that I've read Malazan from a completely different perspective from most other readers that I encounter, who typically tend to be from the Western world. I sort of often joke around with the guys at the Discord channel that I would bring up a non-Western perspective or whatever, and most of it is tongue-in-cheek, to be honest. But some of them have asked me what exactly a non-Western perspective would be, right? Which is, I think, a fair question. One of the major things would be in this exact department, in the mythology department, and in the way that we understand mythology. Because let's face it, there are not too many truly polytheistic cultures around, and there are certainly not many polytheistic cultures around where there are parallels towards the mythology in the Malazan world. Ishkar Jarak made an excellent sort of introductory video in his channel. I suggest that all of you go check it out if you haven't already, where he sort of makes a lot of references to Greek mythology and about how a lot of this is perhaps inspired by Greek mythology. And that's a fair point, but when you think about it, how many people live, breathe, and grow up in Greek mythology because it's a part of their culture? You don't really get that. There are a couple of people who claim to be paganists and all that I've encountered in certain parts of Europe, but let's face it, it's not like Hinduism, where a billion people in many parts of the world follow it, and where it is an active religion, and where, just like with the sort of Malazan law, it's all about gods competing with each other for power, gods rubbing shoulders with mortals, gods playing pranks on the mortals, gods being outmaneuvered and outsmarted by the mortals. And I think that's very important, because when you look at a monotheistic culture or a monotheistic tradition like Judaism or Christianity or Islam, the sort of the conception of divinity there is often omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, right? Because of the whatever, the oneness of God, and because, quote unquote, God in these monotheistic traditions is the overseer of all of creation and the arbiter of all of creation. You don't really get a sense of the sort of power dynamics that you would imagine happens when you grow up in a monotheistic society. Certainly not as much, in my opinion, as you would when you grow up in a polytheistic society. So that's one of the things that I think is kind of worth noting. Erikson himself has made some very interesting observations on mythology. I remember an interview of his. It was a panel discussion, if I remember right, and there were a couple of well-known writers there as well. I think there was Patrick Rothfuss there as well. And one important point that Erikson brought up is that mythology is the root of all literature, because I think the uh, the moderator of the panel, the question that she or he asked the panel was, what role do you think literature's played on fantasy, or something like that? And everybody gave the cliche answer of, oh yeah, literature evolved this way, now we have fantasy, Tolkien, Robert Jordan, blah blah blah, the usual cliched answer that you would get. Erikson was the only one who had an interesting take on it, which is that mythology is what led to fiction and literature. And in a historical sense, he's absolutely right, isn't he? When we think about it, the root of fiction, the root of stories, the root of what would essentially become literature, all of that is rooted in mythology. Mythology was what came first, and that birthed all of this, rather than this Western understanding of fantasy as being a child of literature, rather than the other way around. So Erikson immediately, I think it should be clear to anybody that he has a very, very sophisticated take on this, and that it's perhaps a different take from what other fantasy writers have, particularly in the Western world. I don't want to keep banging on about this Western thing, but I just think that's an interesting sort of dichotomy there, right? Where you have a certain cultural outlook on the fantasy genre, and Erikson has a completely different outlook, and this perhaps helps him understand mythology in a way that many of his contemporaries don't. So let's just look at some of the qualities that we get there, which we might not get often anywhere else. So the first is the power struggle between the gods. In the entire series, I'm not including the other books as well, even though the other books have a lot of that. But in the 10 main books, this whole idea of an elaborate chess game between the gods is brought up over and over again, and I found that to be one of, as a Hindu, I found that to be one of the most enjoyable aspects of the Malazan world, because it was very similar to the sort of other, to my own polytheistic tradition and to other polytheistic traditions I've studied as well, where it's constantly, since there is no one omnipotent being, there are so many of these creatures around, for lack of a better word, creatures around that are competing for that top spot, or for one of the many top spots. For example, the throne of shadow, for example, right? That would be one of the top spots that we see many different powerful entities competing for. Another thing that I really liked and that really resonated with me was the notion that the gods too can be outsmarted by the mortals, which is why Quick Ben is one of my favorite characters, if not my favorite character in the entire series. I will probably do a separate video on Quick Ben pretty soon. But the whole point is, somebody like Quick Ben is shown outwitting the gods. Somebody with enough sort of courage and knowledge and intelligence and wit and, I guess, I mean, compassion, empathy, whatever, right? People with certain traits are shown as being capable of outwitting and outmaneuvering the gods, which again is very sort of interesting and a completely different take from the idea of gods being these ultra powerful entities who can just smash things up. The greed and the folly of gods, and sort of just how human and mortal their desires are, is another interesting thing. You don't find the gods, you do find certain ascendants and godlike figures being detached from reality, at least from what we can see, right? So someone like Edgewalker, for example, we can, at least from what we've seen, the sense that we get is that these guys, or someone like Edgewalker, is detached from reality. But there's no guarantee uh, in that regard. We might find out that Edgewalker is some kind of crazy, greedy bastard in one of the later books, right? But at the same time, we do find certain gods being petty, holding grudges for thousands of years, being jealous of the success of others, being jealous of how revered others are. I've always found that to be extremely interesting. What it's the gods then having friends, right, among the mortals. The gods then sort of being so fascinated by mortals that they sometimes take up these mortals as their companions. I think that's another extremely interesting thing that is not done quite as well in any other literature series that I've read. So if you guys have recommendations, I would love that. But in terms of, let's say, Krupp, Kruppe, and Krull, right, Mile and Tihol, there are so many, not so many, but there are multiple instances where Erikson crafts these human characters, and he makes these human characters so complex and larger than life and interesting that by the time we find out that there are gods and elder gods who are equally fascinated by them and who want these mortals to be their companions, right? It kind of really feels legitimate, it feels sincere, it feels organic. And I really like that about the way Erikson portrays the relationship between the gods and the mortals. I think it was either in Reaper's Gale or Midnight Tides where Bug essentially says, look, do you have any idea what it's like to live forever? Do you have any idea what it's like to sort of just be a constant presence in the universe and not have a friend? And he then sees Tehol and he identifies that this person can give him a brief respite, so to speak, from the sort of cursed life of a god. And that's the final point that I'd like to touch on, which is that being a god itself in the Malazan universe comes with huge consequences. Being a god isn't really something where you necessarily have a happy ending where you are now one of the most powerful universe in powerful creatures, sorry, in the entire universe. No, not at all. It comes with consequences. You can be injured. Look at what happened to Fenner. Look at what Quick Ben threatened to do to Hood in Memories of Ice, if I remember right. So there are so many sort of different facets to it. You are in constant danger if you become a god. There's no way you can sort of reject the calls of your followers, of your worshippers, like with uh, Mile, for example, and what's the guy's name? Malik Rel, right? That evil bastard who kind of crucified Coltane. It specifically said that there's no way Bug can sort of resist that. When your worshippers demand something and they make sacrifices in your name demanding something, you as a god have to answer. You don't have the power to sort of deny that. And all of these ascendants and all of these gods later on have to sort of continue on with their existence, facing the consequences of the actions of their own followers. So Mile slash Bug, whatever, you can never really remove Coltane's death from his legacy because it was his worshipper who was kind of primarily in charge of that entire sort of disaster. You look at someone like Treek, however you want to call it, who has Gruntle, but because he's a young god, he doesn't really have that much power. Treek's legion was kind of decimated by the Kachen Chamal in Memories of Ice, and they say, oh, look, he's not as old as Fenner, he's not as experienced as Fenner. So there are many different angles to it. I'm pretty sure I will be able to think of a lot more once this video ends because, as usual, I haven't really made a list. But yeah, that's my overall snapshot of why I like mythology in the Malazan world, of why I think the portrayal of gods and godhoods in the Malazan world is so much more interesting than the depiction of deities and godhood in other works of epic fantasy that I've read. But once again, I could be sort of just ignorant. So if you guys know of other sort of fantasy series that treat godhood and ascendancy and gods in such a complex way, I would love your recommendations. I love that the gods are petty like the rest of us. I like that they compete with the other gods like the rest of us. I just love that they cannot deny their followers and that things that are done in the name of a god, even if the god has sort of, even if the god has no interest in participating in that course of events, that god really has kind of no choice. If your worshippers demand it, you have to deliver. So yeah, that's about it. If I do think of more, I will probably do another video. But yeah, so kudos to Erikson for being able to bring such a sophisticated sort of take towards gods and towards sort of polytheistic faiths. I mean, it's sort of so impressive that someone who did not grow up in a polytheistic culture, that someone who did not necessarily be raised in a culture where this is our mythology, where we have thousands of different gods, many of them don't like each other, many of them play pranks on mortals, many of them like mortals and then take them as their companions, many of them are just as flawed and greedy and envious as the rest of them. It is so impressive that Erikson was able to capture that in his religious canon in the series. And it's just so impressive that right from book 1 to book 10, that consistency is never lost. that sort of take on what it means to be a god is never lost. So I hope I didn't ramble too much, and I hope I did make some good points that interested you. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.